All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks for such a nice introduction. My name is Carson Ganzer. I'm a performance physiologist, and today we're really going to be focusing on running economy, fatigue, and what we as practitioners of really all different backgrounds can aim to do with these concepts. And so I'd actually like to open up this discussion with a question, which is what makes a good runner? This is your chance to kind of just shout some stuff out. No need to raise hands. What makes a good runner? Intention, maybe. Maybe fitness, good cardiovascular adaptations, not getting gassed going up the stairs, right? And so it turns out that individuals ranging from recreational athletes up to researchers even have been looking to answer this question for decades. And back in 1991, there was a really seminal paper written by a guy named Mike Joyner out of Mayo Clinic. He's probably the most famous exercise physiologist on the planet, arguably. And what he was looking to answer was essentially this question, but a little bit more specifically. And at this time, he was looking at what is currently limiting people from breaking the 2-hour marathon barrier. I think we can all agree if you can run a marathon in 2 hours, you're a pretty good runner, right? And that just happened for the first time maybe a month ago, at least in competitive settings. And he identified 3 different concepts. The first is going to be VO2 max, which a lot of us in this room have probably heard of, whether it be from a performance aspect or a longevity aspect. The second is going to be an individual's lactate threshold, which is a relative percentage of someone's VO2 max. The third, and again, the main topic of today's discussion is going to be running economy. Now, I do want to spend a little bit of time on VO2 max and lactate threshold because I do think it'll be relevant to our conversation going forward. So VO2 max, you've probably seen the mask, you've seen the tube, you've seen people looking like they're about to vomit, probably. And so VO2 max is pretty simply put as the maximal amount of oxygen an individual can utilize during exercise. Now, this isn't where someone's looking to compete when they're doing a marathon. This is really only sustainable for less than 5 to 10 minutes. So when we're looking at elite individuals, this is like running a mile or running the 2 mile. And for more recreational athletes, this could be even running a single kilometer at their fastest pace. And when we're really looking to work at our VO2 max, the goal is to get as much ATP from aerobic metabolism as possible. Now, I mentioned you can't run a marathon in less than 5 to 10 minutes, so you can't run a marathon at your VO2 max. Rather, the elites are looking to run it just about at their lactate threshold, which is a relative percentage of an individual's VO2 max. So if you think of VO2 max as like your 100th percentile, lactate threshold could be working at maybe 85 to 90% for an elite, and for a recreational athlete, probably closer to 65, 70. And lactate threshold is essentially the point at which we essentially get to an intensity where if we go any faster, it's going to get really unsustainable really quickly through the accumulation of metabolites, such as lactate, hence the name of it, hydrogen ions, inorganic phosphate, and ADP. And so for anyone that hasn't seen a lactate curve before, this is one that's pretty textbook, I would say. On this end here, we have very light intensities for this individual. And every point is essentially showing an increase in speed over time. Lactate concentration is all of this area under the curve for us. And so what we see is for a bunch of different intensities, lactate's not moving. That doesn't mean we're not creating it, but we're actually recycling it as quickly as we create it. Up until this blue line right here. This is our first lactate threshold, and this is not actually the threshold that we're talking about. This is still going to be relatively sustainable, but now we're creating more lactate than we can recycle at a given time for this intensity. As we continue to bump up that intensity, we see, okay, there's a bit of a linear increase going on here until that red line. That red line is what we're talking about when we're talking about lactate threshold. That is our second threshold. And this is essentially the speed that if we go any higher, there's a big exponential jump in lactate concentration. So if we look at this point right here, it's going to be 4.2 millimoles of lactate. And then by the same relative jump in speed, we go from 4 all the way to just under 9, where before it was little jumps of maybe 1 or none, right? And so all of that lactate is going to make performance unsustainable. As I mentioned, this is kind of that do not pass mark for elite marathoners and people looking to compete for around 2, maybe 3 hours if you're really looking to stretch it. And so this is kind of the point where we figure out where it is and try to stay just below it or just at it if possible. And as I mentioned before, if you are an elite or if you are recreational, this is going to help decide where your lactate threshold is in comparison to your VO2 max. The more elite you are, the higher that lactate threshold is going to be and the higher relative intensity you're going to be able to compete at. And so when we're thinking about oxygen consumption, higher consumption of oxygen sustainably. Now we actually get to running economy. And running economy is for that oxygen consumption that we're getting, how fast are we actually moving? And what's kind of interesting to learn is that this varies quite a lot, upwards of 30% between trained individuals. And this is shown really well in a figure from Barnes and Kilding back in 2015, a really good narrative review that they had for us here. And if you kind of squint, you can see there's squares and circles here, right? One individual is represented with circles and another with squares. And we can see for every pace, 17, 18, 19, 20 kilometers per hour, we see the square athlete is consistently using less oxygen for a given pace, meaning they're more efficient. And when they eventually get up to the exact same oxygen consumption, which is shown here, in this black dot and black square, we see that the individual with the better running economy, the square individual, is moving over a kilometer per hour faster. That's pretty substantial for the same oxygen consumption. And so this explains why people with the exact same cardiovascular fitness might be moving so differently and at different speeds. And part of the reason why someone that's maybe an elite cyclist can't just jump into marathon running and be lights out. Like I said, up to a 30% variance, which is quite extreme, if you ask me, especially for the same level of fitness. And so with this said, it becomes pretty imperative to notice that running economy is important, right? If you want to be fast and if you want to be efficient, this is something we need to work on. And so what actually goes into determining running economy? And put shortly, a lot of things. And when I say a lot of things, I truly mean a lot of things. And so again, this is from Barnes and Kilding, and it really describes all of the different aspects of neuromuscular, biomechanical, metabolic, and cardiorespiratory efficiency that are going to play a role in this, as well as just general training history and genetics. Obviously, we as practitioners can't manipulate all of these things, especially genetics, unfortunately, but we can change a couple of things. And so the focus of this presentation isn't to go through every single one of these and say why they matter, but rather to focus on some of the key concepts that make running economy what it is, and some of the things that we can look to actually manipulate to improve running economy. And so I think a really good place to start is, what does a quote unquote good runner actually look like, right? And when we look at the research, at least for the correlative evidence, we see a couple of very clear trends. The first is going to be that the elites show a greater max angle of thigh during hip extension. So just think more hip extension rather than less, right? So they're getting more push off of that thigh, essentially. There's also going to be a greater extension of the lower limb at touchdown. And so when we're looking at knee flexion before we touch down, instead of being super soft when we touch down, we're relatively rigid and stiff. And then the third is that the knee angle is going to be more acute during the swing phase, pretty close to that 90th percentile. And so here I have a good runner and a pretty close to elite runner that's looking to be winning trail races for us here. And so if we look at these individuals, while we can't see everything here, we can see that the good runner has a lot more flexion in their knee at touchdown versus that elite runner. That's quite a stiff leg that we're seeing. And similarly, during the swing phase or that follow through phase, this is a far more acute angle than this one here. This is almost, I shouldn't say almost always, this can be a product of how much hip extension someone is actually giving. If you're not giving much hip extension, that leg's just going to follow through, versus if you have a massive hip extension, that leg's going to want to follow through a little bit more with that acute knee angle. And so a lot of practitioners and coaches will look to make kinematic changes, or these essentially angular changes, through cueing. And while sometimes it works really well for individuals, especially beginners, when we look at more advanced individuals, the changes can be a little bit nuanced, especially acutely. And so I want to talk about some of the things that usually try to get addressed with cueing by practitioners. The first of which is going to be cadence and stride length. And when we look at the research, what we see is with relatively advanced runners, they get really good at figuring out what stride length is actually efficient for them. It wouldn't be good for the body to just constantly be moving inefficiently. And a lot of the times the cadence is going to be a product of that. And so with cadence and stride length, a lot of the times these individuals are going to be learning by doing, right? They're essentially adapting to whatever demands they're imposing upon themselves. And when we look in the research at essentially trying to manipulate this acutely, what we see is we go from this relatively optimal running economy, and if we look to increase our stride length, that economy is going to drop. And if we look to decrease that stride length, it also drops acutely. And the reasons for this are different for each one. If we're looking to really increase our stride length, I'm gonna have to recruit a little bit more of my type 2 muscle fibers, which are far less efficient than our type 1s. And I'm gonna have to have more rapid force production to make that happen. Alternatively, if I look to really shrink my stride length, now I have to have a higher cadence, which means more contractions and dealing with more reciprocal motion. And so I'm not saying don't ever change cadence, especially for beginners. This is something you might like to look at doing. But if you are going to do it, you have to recognize that running economy is going to take a hit, at least for a little while, while they're looking to adapt to it. So if someone's running a marathon in 2 weeks and you're saying, bump your cadence up from 140 to 180, there are probably going to be quite a lot of consequences from that running economy side, but also from loading structures differently than we're used to. And if we're asking someone to run a marathon as fast as they possibly can, that's a lot of stress on essentially systems that aren't used to dealing with that stress. The next factor we have is vertical oscillation, which you can kind of think of as how high someone bobs up and down. I like to use the midline for this. And so what we see is with elites, less vertical oscillation seems to be better. So if you see someone that's bouncing up and down like this, that's relatively inefficient. We're looking to go this way, not this way. And so if we're wasting force just going up and down for no reason, that can be quite wasteful. I will say there is a little bit of debate on how little is optimal, because obviously if you want very little vertical oscillation overall, you're going to have to be taking quite a lot of steps, which requires quite a lot of muscle contractions. On the opposite end, if you have a super low cadence and a super high stride length, a lot of the time you're arching over, and so that's going to boost your vertical oscillation. When we're looking at this, a lot of the times you're not telling people, okay, I want you to be more or less bouncy. You're usually making those changes via cadence or stride length. And then finally, foot strike patterns. Depending when you grew up, you might have heard that heel striking is probably the worst thing on the planet because you're always going to get injured. The research does not show that. Right? Some of the best runners on the planet are actually heel strikers, or what we call rear foot strikers. And just like cadence and stride length, people find their best way anthropomorphically to use their body. And so if someone is normally a rear foot striker and we switch them to be a forefoot striker, we're actually going to see detriments to their running economy, at least acutely. So with all of these, we kind of look at a question of, if it isn't broke, should we even aim to fix it? And I'd say, if you have time, maybe, especially if we see through normative data and through testing that someone is suffering on the running economy side, it can absolutely be worth it to play around with some of these metrics, especially if you're doing minor tweaks, so to speak. But if you're looking to make quite major tweaks right before an event, probably not the best idea, especially if you don't have anything to back it up showing that it is actually going to benefit them over time. I will say, big caveat to this is for relatively advanced runners that have already figured out how to be efficient. For beginners, it's a little bit different. And I know there's a lot of PTs in here, and I bet there's more clients than you'd like to admit that come in running for a month and they're already hurt. We might look at them and they might exude a overstride, which means essentially I am sticking my leg way out and there's a long distance from where my center of mass is to where my foot is landing. This is a lot of time why people think heel striking is as bad as it is. It's really because of this overstride. It's quite hard to forefoot strike It's a lot easier to heel strike with this overstride. And that a lot of times is going to lead to some patellofemoral pain or some shin splints as well. And so for individuals like that really haven't found their most efficient way to run yet, it can be really nice to bump up their cadence a little bit and get them to try to land more directly underneath themselves. Moving on, we have the neuromuscular system. And so when we're talking about kinematics and we're talking about this cueing, it's important to realize that these things don't just magically happen. Something has to be responsible for these changes, and that's the neuromuscular system. And I think it's important to really start thinking of running as a skill, just like sprinting is a skill, just like swimming is a skill, just like shooting a basketball or dancing is a skill. And the great thing about this is the more time that we practice a skill, doing it correctly or efficiently, the better and more sustainable it's going to become for us. And we see this in the research. When we're looking at beginners and recreational runners and we compare them to more advanced athletes, what we see is the more advanced athletes tend to have less variation in their own stride, which means their kinematics and their force production is more similar step per step. And we also see that they tend to run a lot more similarly to other good runners, right? There isn't a perfect way to run, but there is less efficient and more efficient ways to run for sure. And we see that the more advanced runners tend to pick that up again just by doing. What we also see is better co-activation of the musculature required for running, right? And so if we can get the whole system to work better together, we are going to be more efficiently running. This leads us to the SAID principle, which, if you remember from undergrad, is specific adaptations to imposed demands. If we want to get better at something, if we want to adapt to something, we have to essentially impose a very specific demand on the system. The reason that this works is because the body does not like homeostasis being disrupted, and it is going to do whatever it can to limit that disruption to homeostasis. So if we are pumping up lactate production and metabolite accumulation because we're a relatively poor runner, the body not only wants to get fitter, it wants to make moving at that exact same pace a lot easier on itself. And one of the most important aspects about running and making it easier on the body itself is the utilization of the stretch shortening cycle. As a quick reminder, the stretch shortening cycle is really characterized as a really rapid eccentric followed by an explosive concentric. And during that rapid eccentric, what we're doing is storing a lot of elastic energy that can later be released in that concentric action. And when we're looking at this from a running economy and an oxygen perspective, this is really low cost, right? This is really friendly. Everything that we're storing in that Achilles in particular is going to be released for us. I wouldn't say energy free, but very energy efficiently. And what's nice is the faster the eccentric motion happens and the faster we convert it to that concentric, the more of that elastic energy we're able to use. It's important to note that for this to occur, we have to have good pre-activation of our muscles. If I run with essentially jello legs, I'm not going to be able to support that action actually occurring. And so as we advance in running, we get better at, again, recruiting and co-activating that muscle to prepare for that touchdown and that loading of the Achilles so we can store that elastic energy. This brings us to stiffness in running. And in the clinics, stiffness usually has quite a negative connotation, usually is associated with pain and relatively poor mobility. But in running, this is a really good thing. When we're looking at stiffness in running, it's really describing how much force is required to deform something. In this case, it is going to be the musculotendinous unit. And so the more force that is required to deform something, the more energy we're going to be able to store in it elastically, which is good because that means we can release more of it and get more propulsion. I really like to think of this as a slingshot. If I have a little twig slingshot with a rubber band and I'm looking to shoot a little rock, I'm going to get some energy from that. I'm going to be able to store and release it. But if I have a reinforced steel beam that I'm tying, I'm sure there's some crazy resistance bands here, and I pull it way back and release it, I'm going to be able to store and release more elastic energy. It's also going to be a lot harder to pull back that elastic band. And so that's that stiffness that we're looking for. It requires a lot of force to pull back that band, but I'm storing a lot of energy that I can later release. And so our tendon in this case is going to be our elastic, and our muscle is going to be that frame that we want to be quite robust. Great thing about stiffness is it is regulated by the neuromuscular system, which means it's trainable, right? This is not something that is going to be purely genetically determined. If we can practice increasing our stiffness and practice utilizing the stretch shortening cycle, we can get better at it. And this is one of, in my opinion, the simplest ways to increase an individual's running economy besides just running more. And so what in particular does more stiffness give us? One of the biggest things is a shorter ground contact time. You really just want to think of that as how many milliseconds does it take for me to get from landing to takeoff again. And as we can kind of remember from the stretch shortening cycle, if that eccentric to concentric is far faster, we're going to get more elastic energy usage of it. And so we get that faster braking to propulsion. We also get a greater ability to attenuate the forces that we're creating. So we're better able to deal with those really high forces that running quite quickly imposes upon us. And lastly, we get a limit to how much time we're actually stabilizing and supporting our mass, which is quite expensive when you think about it. So that's really a brief introduction on running economy and some of the most important aspects of it. And so a really important question that usually comes up is, when someone's running a marathon, why do they look so good in the first 5, maybe 10 miles, and then at mile 25, they look like they're on death's doorbed, right? And the answer is fatigue, right? Something that we've all experienced over time. And when I give a presentation on fatigue, I really like to use 2 pictures of myself actually in a marathon. This first one, I'm about 13 miles in. The smile says it all. Everything's going great. Arm mechanics are even looking good. You can see a decent amount of hip extension going on. And then we move to about mile 25. And again, the face says it all. That is not a face a mother wants to see. Arms are also going here, and there's a lot of hip flexion going on. And as we'll talk about later, that hip flexion is really going to deteriorate our running economy. And so when we're talking about fatigue and running, we're specifically talking about motor fatigue. This is what we think about with exercise-induced fatigue. And when we look in a textbook or in a research article, it's usually described as a decrease in our maximum voluntary contraction ability. Easiest way to think of this is if I can normally leg press 1,000 pounds, when I'm fatigued, my ability to do that is going to deteriorate. Maybe I can only do 900 pounds. So that maximal force production goes down. This is regulated by a couple of different things. And one of them is going to be the nervous system and really how the brain and spinal cord communicates with the muscles and signals it to do its job. On the other end, you have the actual muscles itself, which is termed peripheral fatigue. And this really has to do with how a muscle contractile abilities actually are functioning. And so the things that are going to affect this muscular fatigue are going to be the accumulation of those metabolites, like lactate, like ADP, like inorganic phosphate. Again, we're coming to that lactate threshold again and its importance, but also how well our calcium kinetics are functioning and how our sarcolemma is functioning. All of these are going to influence how well our actin and myosin can create cross bridges and create force. What's important to notice is that this isn't only determined by intensity and duration, right? There are other things that are going to make us more fatigued, and we all know this intuitively. One of the big ones in Phoenix, if you ran outside today, is hyperthermia. I think about everyone here that's lived in Phoenix for a while can say, running in the summer and running in the winter, you move a little bit faster in one, you move a little bit slower in the other, and one is a lot more enjoyable than the other. And how quickly you fatigue is quite different. Similarly, we have hypoglycemia, right? Low blood sugar. If you're looking to run a marathon, it's probably not the best idea to do a 24-hour fast beforehand. We're not going to be very well fueled for that effort, and we're going to fatigue far quicker. So what are the actual consequences to this fatigue when we talk about running economy? Well, obviously, like all of the literature is going to say, we're going to have a reduced force production, and it's going to make it more expensive for us to move at a given pace as we look to. But we're also going to get compensatory changes in how we actually move. So those kinematics and some of those gait metrics are going to change over time and become less efficient. We're going to get an altered running style. And while this might get us to a finish line of a marathon or a half marathon or even a 5K or even the end of just a really hard session, If we are fatiguing and changing our biomechanics while we're doing something at high intensity and for relatively long duration, that is a lot of load that's being placed on structures that previously weren't loaded like that. And I don't think I have to tell any of you in here, if you overload a system that has not previously been loaded, it's not always the best thing to do, and injury risk is probably going to increase for us. And so let's get into some more specifics about what this fatigue causes and kind of why these changes happen. One of the biggest ones for us here is a decrease in that stiffness and a decrease in our ability to utilize the stretch shortening cycle. We're also going to get a decrease in the amount of power that we can produce from the ankle. If we want to move at the exact same pace, what we're going to have to do is essentially give that work to other musculature to produce that speed. And so this decrease in stiffness and power of the ankle joint is going to lead to higher ground contact times, more time on the ground, less time using the stretch shortening cycle. Where do we get the rest of that energy? And the answer is essentially we try to get it from the musculature of the hips and everything surrounding the knees as well. So we are going to be much more proximally loaded than distally loaded as we run. And this is going to lead to a quite dramatic increase in oxygen requirements. And this style of running is termed Groucho running. Quite a fun name and frankly quite old research that's still quite valuable to us today. So what is Groucho running? I tried to draw a nice little picture of it to illustrate it. Here's my little stick figure. And those are supposed to be angles in the red there. And so we can see this individual running, he's hyperflexed at the hips and at the knees. Kind of like what we would see at the end of a marathon when people are falling apart, so to speak. And this is essentially a mechanism of the body to try to reduce how much shock the body's dealing with. Unfortunately, when we do this, we're also diminishing our stiffness and again, diminishing how well we can utilize the stretch shortening cycle. And so when researchers wanted to see, okay, we see people adopt this style, what are the actual consequences of it versus when they're running normally? We see that there's an oxygen increase for a given pace of upwards of 50%. If I told you I'm going to make running 50% harder for you at a given pace, you'd probably be pretty upset. So we want to do whatever we can to avoid this from occurring. The other things that we're going to experience with this fatigue are greater tibial accelerations and vertical loading rates. And that's going to predispose individuals, theoretically at least, to an increase in stress fracture risk. We're also going to see an increased variability in the trunk pelvis hip complex, which essentially means our coordination is going to be influenced so that our distribution of forces is going to be different and less efficient. We also see greater interlimb asymmetry. So maybe my right leg is still looking really good, but my left leg's holding on for dear life, right? That right leg's going to end up doing a lot more work, and some of the things in that left leg might be unevenly loaded, which again can predispose us to additional injury risk. And then finally, reduced balance and stability, right? Doesn't put our joints in a really good place. If we're needing to make a 180-degree turn in a situation like this, watch out for your ankle. Something important I want to note is this is not exclusive to marathon running or even running sports in general. When we look at soccer, when we look at American football, when we look at baseball, as the body fatigues, all of these same things are going to continue to happen. It is not just when you're going 2 hours. If you've ever worked with youth soccer and it's 115 degrees outside on August 1st at 1 p.m., you can see these kids are slouching down and their ability to create and actually react to forces is going to be hampered. A lot of times we're also going to see those injuries are occurring later in those games when that fatigue onsets. What can we actually do about it as practitioners? Most of us in here are not running coaches. I know we do have some, which is awesome. You guys have a lot more control than the rest of us do. A lot of us are just kind of giving advice in the 20 minutes that we might have with an individual. And I hate to break it to you, but fatigue is going to happen whether or not we like it, right? And so what we can really do is only hope to increase our ceiling for something like running economy and slow how quickly that running economy depreciates over time. And now this is where I want to talk about the things that pretty much all of us can do to make recommendations for individuals. The first of which is strength training and plyometric training. Endurance athletes hate to see these words on their program. Most of them are still afraid of getting bulky, even though they don't realize you can't become a bodybuilder working 2 days a week, for most people at least. And they also think, oh my gosh, I'm gonna be sore and I'm gonna be slow. And so as practitioners, it's really important that we get the message across. One, I'm not trying to get you bulky. Two, I'm trying to make you faster and more injury resilient. And we have to essentially make it clear that we're doing this for a neuromuscular perspective. We are not doing this for a bodybuilding or muscle building perspective. And so we have to make the focus about relatively heavy strength training and quite explosive plyometric training, right? Because we're looking for neuromuscular adaptations, we have to demand quite a lot from the neuromuscular system, which both of these are quite good for. I also really like drills, right? I know we have a sprinting coach in here, and so when we're talking about things like high knees, bounding, the things that aren't normally thought of in the general public as plyometrics, skips, A-skips, lateral bounds, these are all really beneficial as well for increasing our stiffness and our neuromuscular skills. And so with this greater neuromuscular efficiency, what we're essentially asking the body to do is use less demand to get the same output, right? We want to lessen our energy costs for a given pace and delay fatigue accumulation just by using our nervous system better and recruiting muscles better. And so specifically how this is theorized to happen is via enhancements in better signaling of that central nervous system to the musculature. We also expect to see better motor unit recruitment of the muscles that we actually need. So maybe leaving those type 2 fibers alone and really focusing on those type 1 heavy muscle fibers. We also want to get a greater force production. If we increase our ceiling, we're going to increase the relative intensity at which we can perform. We get greater muscle stiffness, which you guys are probably really tired of hearing that word stiffness now, but I cannot say how important that is for running economy. And then lastly, and in my opinion, something that's still quite developing here for us is a greater durability and a greater time to exhaustion during hard efforts. For those of us that aren't familiar with the concept of durability in endurance sport, when we're looking at running in particular, it's how long can I maintain that optimal running economy, or how much can I slow that depreciation? And it is getting a lot of attention right now, not only in running, but in professional cycling and triathlon as well, because if you can have a really good top end and you don't drop off as well, you're gonna do quite well. Something I skipped, the reported increases in running economy from strength training and plyometric training, not talking crazy amounts here, are anywhere from 3 to 8%. For those of us that remember when Nike came out with their 4% shoe, the Vaporfly, it was claiming 4% running economy increases. If you can tell someone that picking up heavy stuff and putting it down and doing a bunch of jumping is going to give them pretty close to as much, if not more, they're going to be pretty happy with those results. And so I do want to touch on that durability and that emerging research. I apologize, this is going to get really wordy, so you do not have to read all of this. It's quite clunky. I apologize. This is the name of the study for us, but quite simply, researchers wanted to see, okay, when we have decent runners, VO2 maxes of 56, so they're by no means slouches, but also not elites. What happens when we ask them to do strength training for a decent period of time, which ended up being 10 weeks? And so they took this massive group of runners, I shouldn't say massive, they took a decently sized group of runners, and they had them do a pretty brutal protocol, to be honest with you. So at baseline, they were asked to run 90 minutes in between their LT1 and LT2. If we go way back to that chart at the beginning, that's in between that blue and that red line where there's a good amount of lactate accumulation, but we're not getting crazy with it. While they were doing this, they were having their running economy measured every 15 minutes. At the end of this, they did a time to exhaustion trial at 95% of their VO2 max. So kind of think of this as me asking you to do a hard run for 90 minutes and then sprint finish for as long as you can at your maximum capacity. It is not really a fun ask, especially on a treadmill by yourself, right? But this is the beginning. They then split them up into 2 groups, one that was going to do strength training for 10 weeks and one that was exclusively going to do running. Strength training group did still continue their running, and it wasn't a lot. It was 2 days. 45 minutes each day, but it was quite heavy and the plyometrics were quite intense. But in terms of time, 130 minutes, not bad. They then had them repeat the trial at the end of the 10 weeks. And the results are as followed. The strength training group from minute 60 to minute 90 experienced less of a drop-off in their running economy than the group that just ran. And those percentages for us, initially it was just below 5%, and then after it's a little bit above 2%. So about 2.6% difference in that running economy drop-off in those final 30 minutes. That's quite a lot, even though these percentages are relatively small. We also saw that the rating of perceived exertion during this run was significantly lower. So those 90 minutes felt a lot easier for these individuals that had done the strength training. Last one for us is an increased duration on that time to exhaustion test of 35%. This is a lot, right, if we look at it in percentiles, but for pure numbers, it was about 250 seconds initially, and it was about 310 seconds after. But a minute more at pretty close to your VO2 max after a hard 90-minute session, that's a pretty big difference for us overall. Now, this is kind of showing the benefits of strength training. It is kind of hard to get runners to do this and to do it correctly. And a lot of the time we want to refer these individuals to practitioners that can work one-on-one with them, especially if they're relatively new. The next topic that we're going to talk about for this is also one that we probably want to refer to maybe a dietitian or a specialist for as well, which has to do with diet and carbohydrate consumption, right? Anyone in here that has done a really long distance event or has had a friend or anyone they know do a long distance event, we're probably familiar with carbohydrate loading, right? Eating a massive bowl of pasta, some people down entire boxes of cereals. I'm a fan of that. It's very easy for me. And the goal of this is to essentially start with the biggest bank of carbohydrates you possibly can in the form of glycogen. Glycogen is just that stored glucose molecule for us. We store a little bit in our liver, which is great, but we store the majority of it in our muscles. And the size of an individual and how much glycogen that they've previously stored is going to influence how much they can store going forward. The more you can store, the more you have banked up to actually use when you exercise. The reason that individuals are looking to increase this bank is because carbohydrate burns much more efficiently than fat does. So while we have lots of fat that we can dip into whenever we want, if we're looking to maximize our speed, that fat is going to hold us back. And so if we can have a really big bank of that gasoline that we need to drive, we can burn through it pretty readily. On the other end, if we go with low glycogen levels, like say we go 24-hour fast before a race, our glycogen is going to prevent us, or I should say our lack of glycogen is going to prevent us from working as hard as we possibly can, and it's going to lead to additional fatigue quite quickly. There's actually a chart on the next slide that I really want to focus on to illustrate this. This chart's by a guy named Asker Jukendrup, who's done a lot of work with the UCI, which kind of think of that as the organizing body for professional cycling, like the Tour de France. And so when we're looking at this chart, we've got our exercise intensity here, and we've got the fuel use in kilojoules per minute. Our purple section is going to be our muscle glycogen. So as we can see, if we go pretty heavy, oh my gosh, muscle glycogen is pretty much all of that for us. In this red or orangish section, we have plasma glucose, which think of it as blood glucose. Still makes up a pretty good component of this. And then this more yellowish, more traditional orange here is going to be our fat percentage. We see that's maxed out at like 50 to 60% of our maximum intensity. So by no means are we going to be able to PB working at 50 to 60% of our max. We want to be able to dip into these carbohydrates. And so starting with that really big bank of glycogen is going to make that really easy for us to burn through it. But we've also probably seen people jamming gels down their throat and sports drink. That also has a purpose. And while for a while we thought it was to replenish our muscle glycogen, what we later found out was it was more about maintaining our plasma glucose levels. So this red area here, we wanted to make sure that was topped off for us, and so we could maintain that carbohydrate oxidation or carbohydrate burning. And so when people are downing these, what they're really looking to do is prevent that liver glycogen from replenishing the blood and that blood glucose going to the muscle to be used. And so if we can spare that liver glycogen, we're also going to limit how quickly an individual fatigues. The amount that people take when they're racing varies quite dramatically, both on their pace and their ability to oxidize carbohydrates. And that leads us to this really nice chart here, which is from a company called Precision Fuel and Hydration. Some of you are probably quite familiar with it. They make great content. And what this shows is on our y-axis, we have intensity, and on our x-axis, we have duration. As intensity and duration increases, so will the benefits, essentially, of intaking additional carbohydrates while competing. Up to 90 grams per hour plus. If we think of that from a calorie perspective, that's 360 calories plus of just straight up sugar, right? While you're exercising. That can be quite a lot. And so is it always necessary to do this? If I'm going for a 30-minute jog, should I be jamming a gel down my throat? The answer is probably not, right? Unless you've had nothing to eat, maybe it is a little bit better of a decision for you. But most governing bodies in the area of dietetics is going to recommend, if you're going above an hour, it's probably a good idea to have a little something. It doesn't have to be a gel. It can be natural food as well, but we want a little bit of glucose to enter that system. And what we find is that higher consumption rates are usually going to end up giving us greater efficiency during running. And so while you can take 30 grams an hour on a marathon and end up doing pretty well, the research would suggest that if you can intake more and actually oxidize more of it, we're going to be better able to maintain that running economy. When we looked at this with elite marathoners, and we essentially asked them to go 120 minutes at 94 to 95% of their lactate threshold, there it is again, we saw some pretty interesting outcomes. When we jumped from 60 grams an hour to 90 grams an hour, we found that running economy was 1.5% better. For these elites, that 1.5% matters quite a lot. That is the difference between winning and losing. When they were bumped up to 120 grams an hour, 480 calories of straight up sugar, that increased to 3.6% changes in running economy for a beneficial effect. Carbohydrate intake is important for running. And this is one of those things where I'm sure some of us in here have talked to runners that enter their runs fasted. They don't eat anything while they're running at all either. And it is straight up hampering them. Right? We don't need them to take 120 unless they're elites. They're probably not going to be able to oxidize it, and they're probably going to deal with GI distress. But we should be encouraging, hey, proper fueling, utilize carbohydrates, especially for your hard and long sessions. The last thing for us, pretty relevant living in Phoenix, is hydration. Right? Most of us have heard of dehydration, but some of us might not be able to exactly say when dehydration occurs. Most scientists will argue that hypohydration or dehydration begins to occur at a 2% weight loss from fluid losses, which means if I weigh 100 pounds, right when I go to 98, I am going to be dehydrated. And the reason that they chose this was because this is when aerobic performance starts to dip, mainly from a loss in plasma volume within the blood. So we got the red blood cells and we have the plasma that it's essentially flowing through. And when we lose some of that plasma volume through dehydration, we're going to experience more cardiovascular strain. We're trying to send the same amount of red blood cells to the working musculature with less fluid to actually bring them there. So the heart's going to have to work harder and increase its beats per minute to deliver that oxygen. We also see that our core temp is going to increase. This is going to lead to quite a lot of fatigue because it's a huge disruptor of homeostasis. And if you remember what I said previously, the body will do everything it can to not disrupt homeostasis, including making you faint on the side of the road to stop you. We also have an increase in that glycogen utilization. So like I said, even if you intake a lot of carbohydrates while you're training, that doesn't replenish the glycogen. Once it's banked up, we're really trying to budget it as much as we can over a race. And if we are dehydrated and if we have this increase in cardiovascular work, we're also going to have an increase in how much glycogen we're using. And similarly, we're going to have different skeletal muscle recruitment patterns. So we might be recruiting more of those type 2 muscle fibers, which are far more expensive, and increase how much glycogen that you're using for a given intensity. Lastly, again, like we talked about, if you're dehydrated and you're running, it's not going to feel very good. Right? You're going to have discomfort. You're going to have neurological fatigue. It's just going to be a bad time. And how you feel while you're running actually does matter on your performance. It's important to note, this is not just going to be determined by how much you drank the night before. If it's super hot outside, if you're working super hard, and if you're out there a long time, this is going to essentially determine how dehydrated you get, how quickly that occurs. And so it becomes exceptionally important to test this. And for the hydration component, at least, it's a relatively simple way to do it, right? You wake up in the morning, if you run in the morning, I should say, you use the restroom, and then you weigh yourself nude right before you go outside. You then put your clothes back on, you go for a run for a given amount of time, you come back, you get back in the nude, and you weigh yourself again. How much weight was lost during that time? That tells us how much sweat that we lost. And while I would not recommend, especially for a 1 hour run, to replenish that much while you're going, it can be quite insightful, especially if you're working with a professional, to essentially race plan based on that data. And because we know that's going to change pretty dramatically with how hard that we're working, or how long we're working, or how hot it is, it's very useful to get multiple measurements for this. I also want to talk quickly about electrolytes. A lot of electrolyte companies have been riding on a high. The marketing for it has been awesome, which is great for their bottom line. But most people don't need nearly as much electrolytes as they think, especially when they're competing. With a Western diet, pretty much everyone in here is going to get more than they need anyways. And so this is something that you can't really test at home. You're going to have to go to either a laboratory or a university to get it tested. But this is one thing that, if we overdo or underdo, is also going to play a pretty significant portion on how quickly we fatigue. And so to kind of wrap this all up, we talked a bit about running economy. We know we want to work at a certain pace for a given amount of time, but that really just has to do with oxygen consumption. How fast we're actually moving depends on something completely different, which is that running economy. We also talked about that there's a lot of things that we as individuals can't change about a person, like genetics. Most of us can't change exactly how they're training, but there are things that we can recommend, either as strength and conditioning coaches, physical therapists, and other professions that can look to make adaptations to the neuromuscular system, or at least advise them on them. And so this is going to be cueing, making different changes through the running gait cycle. If someone is showing no hip extension and they have a cadence of 200 steps per minute, there might be a couple of changes that we look to make via cueing. Make sure to give time for these adaptations to actually set in before we say, okay, now go race. Because if we overload the system and we ask it to do something completely different, that doesn't usually work out too well from an injury prevention point of view. We can also utilize drills, and these are going to be these extensive plyometrics that we briefly talked about. So the utilization of skipping and high knees and butt kicks. This can help us to learn how to run a little bit better outside of actually running. And so a lot of individuals will use these as part of a warm-up to essentially warm up the neuromuscular system to try to run as efficiently as possible. Lastly, we have the strength and plyometric portions of things. This is just going to be so important for that stiffness. Again, there it is. The utilization of the stretch shortening cycle, and also improving our maximal force production capacities. If we want to be a better runner, this stiffness and stretch shortening cycle usage is going to be imperative, not just for long distance running, but also sprinting as well. And lastly, we don't want our athletes and clients to suffer because of something silly, like they didn't drink enough, or they didn't eat enough the night before or while during their races. These are things that can very easily be avoided with, I think, relatively simple aspects, and they can be brought to the very top level with additional help from other practitioners. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you guys so much for being here. Are there any questions I can answer?
With sprinting, correct?
Yes, for sure. But the way we think about sprinting is a little bit different than how we would think about something like marathon running. Because when we're looking at sprinting, we can utilize something like more hip extension to a greater degree than we can marathon running. If I really tried to essentially sprinting is almost like bounding when we really think about it. If I tried to bound a marathon, I'd be in a lot of trouble really quick, right? I would be very tired. And so with sprinting, these biomechanical changes and kinematic changes are going to be quite different. Some of the things that are super similar, though, is going to be that utilization of that stretch shortening cycle and the stiffness. And this is something that we didn't really talk about, but the faster you go, the greater that requirement of stiffness, because you're creating so much more force. If you crumble with that force, we can't use the stretch shortening cycle. Equally, your ability or your tendency for additional vertical oscillation is going to be way different. When we see sprinters, they are up in the air when they're actually traveling at top speed. That is not something that we're going to see with most marathon runners, at least to that degree. Other things with sprinting that are a little bit more important, I think, is just the transition from the actual acceleration phase to that top end speed. There's, in my opinion, frankly, so much more technique in something like sprinting than there is in marathon running. And there's so much more co-activation that's going to be required to make that difference for us. I forgot to repeat the question. Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah.
So with the study that you showed with running and strength training,
Yes.
they were having a frequency of 2 times a week. Is that typically what you would recommend for most marathon runners for strength training?
Yeah, for sure. I think 2 times a week is that healthy middle ground because it gives you enough time to actually, 1, make adaptations, but 2, rest in between. I'm a big fan of what's called undulating periodization, which is making your hard days kind of ridiculously hard and then making your easy days super easy. And so if we're doing 2 hard sessions a week, we can back that up with the strength training afterwards. So we get this really high neuromuscular fatigue that's going to occur with that, but a lot of time to recover. And with runners, especially those that have not lifted previously, 2 days is more than enough. Some will stretch it out to 3, but diminishing returns, I would say, really after 2. But that's a great question. Yes.
Would there ever be a time that you would recommend compensatory patterns for someone that had an injury like an Achilles tendon repair that could affect like the transfer of energy?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. The question was, is there any reason that we would want someone to run essentially with an altered style, maybe due to a long-term injury? And for me, my opinion is yes, at least temporarily, and especially because they're not going to be able to run for like 60 minutes in the first go. And although I'm not a physical therapist, I know that loading that tendon is going to be an important process. And so if we can get that with relatively low impact through something like running with an altered gait style, I would say that's probably appropriate. We just have to make sure we can transition them out of it as that something like the Achilles becomes stronger. I will say, as someone that's not a PT, I would probably refer to someone else for that. But in my opinion, that loading is going to be important no matter how we get it. And because they're not looking to perform at that time, I would say it's probably appropriate. Yes?
Do you still take these concepts and apply them to like our avid hikers?
I think you can apply, the question was, would you apply this to someone like an avid hiker? I think some of these things will apply really well. Like I do think the strength training is going to be imperative. I do think obviously being hydrated and consuming enough glucose is going to be imperative. But for some of these other components like utilizing the stretch shortening cycle, we almost have to compare running more to walking. And while walking, we absolutely still use the stretch shortening cycle. You'll be hard pressed to find anything that does not use the stretch shortening cycle in human movement. It's going to be a little bit to a lesser degree. I would still recommend it though, because it's not zero and because it's going to build a more robust individual that's going to allow them to perform their activities more efficiently and with less risk, I would say. It's a great question. Yes.
Going back to the study, do you know with the strength protocol that they were using, it was more like single leg, double leg?
So I actually just refreshed it this morning. The main movements for us was a single leg press. I believe they had a bilateral squat in there. They progressed their plyometrics from pogos to box drops and from I want to say it was box jumps to single leg bounding. And then they included some isometric calf raises. But that was pretty much it. It was like one major bilateral movement, one major unilateral movement, and those calf raises for the actual quote unquote resistance training movements. The sets were relatively limited. I think it was 2 to 3 per set, but the load, especially towards the final weeks, was 85 to 90% of maximal capacity. So they're only doing like 3 reps for a single leg press, which is quite strenuous. Great question though. Yes.
I noticed on that study, it was done on men only.
Yeah.
If there's any female research for strength training with endurance athletes that might be different based on like fatigability and the fluctuation in hormones. Male athletes?
I don't know enough about that hormonal component because, frankly, I did not pay that close attention to the study that I'm going to talk to you about. But I do know that they actually did something quite similar with biathletes dual athletes. So bike runners most of the time is what those individuals are going to be. And while they didn't measure running economy, they had them do similar tests and they just looked for improvements over time. And they saw pretty similar improvements, I think during the longer component, it was actually greater improvements. Time to exhaustion was a little bit different, but the same product seems to exist there for us with female athletes. And that, I can link that to you if you want afterwards and you can give it a read. But it is seen in both men and women, but very emerging research. You're gonna be hard pressed to find much really good literature actually looking at randomized control trials with durability. Yes.
Now going back to like keeping the hard days hard or easy days easy, did they program the lifting and the plyos before or after your rep?
That is a great question. The question was, did the study do the lifting after or before the running? To be completely honest, I'm not sure. My guess would be they tried to keep the running the main priority for them and they followed it up with the lifting, but I have to double check that for you.
Time for one more question.
Yes.
For training for a marathon within the last 80 months leading up to the race, how much variability would there be within that strength training program where as the mileage ramps up, would the strength training decrease leading up to the race where the mileage is increasing, or is 2 days still most optimal?
That's a great question. The question was essentially, as we're periodizing closer to a marathon and we're looking to peak, do we drop that strength training volume off at all? And everyone's favorite answer, it depends. Depends on your coaching philosophy. I can only kind of speak for myself. I keep it up until that final week, and then instead of doing 2 days a week for that final week, I do 1 day and give myself the rest of that time to taper. I like the feeling just psychologically of still giving hard effort, still feeling springy before going into a race. Some people, if they taper too hard, so to speak, will go in feeling a bit sluggish. And so I think it really depends on the individual and you kind of have to meet them where they're at. And again, we have to pay attention to that psychology. So if you're working with people that absolutely hate the resistance training and are only doing it because you tell them to, they'll probably benefit from you pulling off the gas a little bit as long as we maintain that high intensity.
You guys would go ahead and give Carson a round of applause.
Thank you guys.